On today's Locked On Jayhawks deep dive into a potential portal target, would they dare? Arthur Kaluma.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can give me a follow on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and you can find me here with the show with Locked On Jayhawks anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show so you're always catching all of our stuff here. On today's edition of LOJ, we're having another player deep dive of a player in the transfer portal that maybe KU could kick the tires on. And that would be one that would be a little bit weird because that is Arthur Kaluma, who objectively is one of the better players remaining in the transfer portal. But anytime you have somebody who is transferring from one of your rival schools, it gets a little weird having that discussion. So let's get into that discussion if it makes any sense. Scouting report, would they actually do it? Possible fit with KU, and the latest news in the offseason from Bill Self speaking yesterday at a golf event or a couple days ago about wanting to add one more and kind of backing up everything that is going to go into this episode or future episodes about, adding another player. First, this episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Let's start with information on Arthur Kaluma. So Kaluma is a 6'7", 225-pound wing /4/3. He is originally from Glendale, Arizona. He spent 3 years at Creighton, and then he was most recently with Kansas State last season, or 2 years at Creighton. And he was listed as a 4-star transfer and 19th overall by 24/7 Sports. So, this is one of the better transfer recruits that is available in the country. He went through the draft process this year. That's his second time going through it after he went through it, last year as well. And it was kind of similar situation. Last year, he was on Creighton, went to the draft process, and then entered the transfer portal, ended up transferring after the draft process. This year, entered the draft process. He's in the portal right now, and so could transfer again post-draft process. And there was some reported interest last season. To what degree, I'm not entirely certain about Kansas and Arthur Kaluma last year. But obviously Kevin McCullough ended up spurning the NBA draft a year early and ended up coming back. There is a real chance if Kevin McCullough would have ended up staying in the NBA draft in 2023, that Arthur Kaluma might have been a Jayhawk. I don't know. Maybe Grant Nelson would have been a Jayhawk. I don't know. Maybe neither of those happened, but it's entirely possible that would have been the case. And I don't know how far the line Bill Self got there in terms of the contact and stuff, but there was some reported level of contact. Now, so far this portal season, there has been no reported contact or interest, but maybe by already establishing those back channels last year, that stuff stays more quiet this year. I don't entirely know. Anyway, he came into college at Creighton as a top 50 recruit and a 4-star player on a team that ended up losing to Kansas in the second round of the NCAA tournament. Shout out to the 2022 national champion Kansas team, right? And if you remember, Arthur Kaluma went off in that game against Kansas in the second round. Kansas playing against Creighton, Ryan Kalkbrenner had just gotten hurt in the first round of the postseason. And so Creighton was forced to play more of a small ball 5, which basically Kansas said, hey, we're not going to be able to guard everybody from beyond the perimeter, knowing that we play a more traditional big man. We're going to risk it and leave Arthur Kaluma open. And Arthur Kaluma, who was shooting in the mid-20s from 3 percentage-wise, ended up going off from 3-point range. He ended up with 24 points in the game in what was nearly a Creighton upset over Kansas. He ended up averaging 10.4 points, 5.4 rebounds per game. Pretty good numbers for a freshman on a team that made the second round of the NCAA tournament. Then in year 2 at Creighton, his numbers did rise, not a gigantic degree, but they did go up. 11.8 points per game, 6 rebounds per game as a sophomore. His 3-point shooting percentage went up from 26.5% as a freshman to 31% as a sophomore. And that was on that Creighton team that made the Elite Eight and nearly went even further. I mean, they barely lost to San Diego State on that foul call in the Elite Eight. And then at that point, you're playing in Florida Atlantic in the semis. And then you did beat UConn earlier that year. Maybe you have been the one team that wouldn't have lost by 1 billion points to UConn in that tournament. I don't know. So clearly was a good team and had real production and was a starter on that team. Then he transfers this past season, which honestly, like looking back, it's so weird to go from an Elite Eight team at Creighton to then a Kansas State team that didn't make the NCAA tournament this past season. And I get it. There's more stuff involved in this NIL opportunity, whatever else. Sometimes you just have the wrong people in your corner telling you stuff. I don't know if that was the case here. I mean, Kansas State, for what it's worth, was coming off an Elite Eight too. So, right, when you're looking at when he was in the transfer portal, it's a little different. But he ended up averaging 14.4 points per game, 7 rebounds per game, 2 assists. That's really good production for those three. 0.8 steals, 0.5 blocks per game on almost 49% from 2-point shots, 34.5% from 3. That's on 4.5 3-point attempts per game. He was 42.7% from the field overall, and he was at 74.7% at the foul line. So, I wouldn't say like super efficient numbers from Arthur Kaluma this past season, but I wouldn't say those are like non-efficient numbers, I guess, in a way either. Because he did get the 3-point shooting up a little bit. Like we've talked about this before. Kevin McCullough had a 56.4 true shooting percentage, though that number, for what it's worth, was down to 51.2% in conference only games, which, again, he was playing through some injury and stuff like that, which is obviously going to impact some of those numbers. But Arthur Kaluma had a 54.8% true shooting percentage, and in conference only games he was 25th in the Big 12 with a 55.1 true shooting percentage. So by conference play, he was actually more efficient than what Kevin McCullough ended up being. So I don't know. It was better than maybe it looks, is I guess what I'm saying. For his career, though, he's only at a 31.2% mark from 3-point range. That's on 3.8 attempts per game. So, that's solid volume, but that's not solid efficiency. That's below average. But the number has gotten better every season, which makes you believe he is getting better. I mean, that's what a lot of these kids, they stay in college and they get better at their game from year in to year out, right? And so there's reason to believe that he is more of the guy that he was this past season, or that he could even get better from this past season, because he went from 26.5% as a freshman to 31.1% as a sophomore to 34.5% as a junior. And it's not just a case of, he was only taking 1 or 2 threes per game. And it's just one year he, got a little bit luckier. He had a 5-game stretch where he made an extra couple of threes and it was low volume. The volume's gone up each and every year for him. 3.3 as a freshman, 3.6 as a sophomore, 4.5 as a junior. So the volume's going up, the efficiency's going up. And like that leads me to believe that as a senior this next season, I don't think it would be crazy for him to be a 36% 3-point shooter on 4 to 5 attempts per game. And that's, well above average, to say the least. Like, that's good. He's also a good defensive rebounder. He rated top 25 in Big 12 only games in defensive rebound rate. He was strong at drawing fouls. He was top 10 in conference games in drawing them per 40 and free throw rate. And that's part of the reason his true shooting percentage was so good. I would describe him as an inconsistent player. He scored 20 or more points on 6 occasions last season, so really went off. He had 18 or more points on 9 occasions last season, but he also had 5 games where he scored single digits, and he had 10 games of 11 or less points. So you have kind of a third of the 18 plus point games. You have a third of like the 11 or less points games, and then you have a third of kind of somewhere in the middle, and that's how you end up averaging what you average. But it's not the same as like a guy like Frank Mason, who every game was like between like 15 and 25. You know what I mean? It's just a little bit different there and what you can count on. So some of the synergy numbers on Arthur Kaluma: 64th percentile in spot up shooting, including 32 of 95 or 33.7% from 3 on spot up threes. So about average there. 60th, above average in terms of all spot ups, but on threes specifically. But 60th percentile catch and shoot, including 46 of 127. That's 36.2% from 3 on catch and shoot threes. He was also in the 80th percentile in unguarded catch and shoot threes, going 45.7% from 3. Now, we saw KU play K-State twice. Tyler Perry could create a lot of stuff. Kaluma could create some stuff, right? They had some guys that could create some stuff, but that was not a pretty offense to run to watch last season, I guess is a way that I would put it. If you're putting him in a Kansas offense that is getting him more unguarded threes, whereas with K-State, it felt like the team was taking a lot of guarded catch and shoot threes. Now, I think some of that was shot selection from Kaluma and Perry and some of these guys. Like, it wasn't all just coaching, not drawing up plays. Some of it was shot selection. But if you're getting more unguarded catch and shoot threes, I mean, he shot 46% on those, and that would transfer better at Kansas probably. 13th percentile off dribble jumpers, so did not do well off the dribble. 31st percentile in runners, did not do well there. Second percentile between short to 17 feet, so did not do well on basically, again, like floaters and whatever. 47th percentile in layups, so that's at least like average. 64th percentile in transition, good transition player. 20th percentile as a pick and roll ball handler, so you just wouldn't really ask him to do that at Kansas, which I don't think you'd need him to because you have enough options there. 72nd percentile offensive rebound putback. That's something that he was good at. 54th percentile as a cutter, so that's something you could work with Hunter Dickinson and Dewana at your least average at it. 19th percentile in isolation, so again, that was something he was asked to do more at K-State, and it wasn't ultra efficient. In his 2 years at Creighton, he was a good post-up player too, and a good transition player, but he was bad at spot-up shooting, but he was much better at it last year at Kansas State. He also, this is interesting, 87th percentile defensively last season on synergy, 87th percentile. He was oddly in the 12th percentile his sophomore season at Creighton, but you go back to his freshman season at Creighton, he's in the 82nd percentile for the Bluejays. So he has 2 years of registering over 80th percentiles defensively. So for my money, I do view him as a solid defender. And I think what's interesting is his percentile finishes have actually done better when he's played the 3 than the 4, even though I almost view him as more of a modern 4. But here's the team defensive ranks of the squads he's been on. Now, this doesn't all say about him, but I do think it correlates that you can say, okay, no matter where this guy goes, they've had good defenses, so I don't think you can say he's a bad defender, right? K-State was 25th, Creighton was 14th and 19th in his 2 seasons. I think he's a good defender, and there's a lot to like here. Certainly there's some inconsistencies and, some shot selection stuff, but I think you can make it work. Let's talk about that possible fit with KU on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. First, this episode is brought to you by Game Time. Makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. They have killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee makes Game Time take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets or really whatever you're trying to get into. You can actually find tickets to the Royals game this weekend. They're playing against the Mariners for a 3-game series as low as $20. And with Game Time, you can see the seat view of what you're getting into when you're buying whatever seat you want. Plus, with last-minute deals, save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets or MLB tickets or, again, any of that stuff with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDON COLLEGE for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, Arthur Kaluma fit with KU. So this I think was interesting. Kaluma at the NBA Draft Combine measured in with a 7'1/4" wingspan. That is a lot of wingspan. And at 225 pounds, he really can play the 4 well, and you see that reflected in some of the rebound numbers, and I think some of the defensive numbers, in why he can be really good on both of those things. But obviously, like we kind of pointed out, in some ways he did better as a 3. I think offensively it's better if he's the 4. I think defensively, I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter as much. But for KU, if you're bringing on a player like that, it's nice to have that versatility because you don't know. Are you going to end up having to play him in a lineup next to KJ Adams where he is playing the 3? Or are you going to basically have him play some minutes at the 3 and then he can be the backup 4 to KJ Adams? And yes, KU has players that can play 4 minutes. KJ is going to play some 4 minutes. You could play Zach Clemence at the 4. Again, not a fan of that. AJ Storr can play 4 minutes, but he's not a great rebounder. Could play Rylan Griffen at the 4, but he's a little, skinnier and not 6'8" or anything like that. He'd be better playing the 2 and the 3. So like you have guys who can play the 4, but the ones that are going to be primary 4s, it's like KJ and, that's kind of it. So this would possibly give you an opening there to have more of a true 4, I guess, in that sense, and another wing on the roster. But the question would be, where is the role allocation here for Arthur Kaluma? I think it's interesting. Again, I mentioned he's a top 20 transfer on 24/7 Sports, but I'm not sure he would be one of KU's 5 best players. Okay, so you have, and maybe that's not even part of the discussion. I don't know. Maybe you can have a discussion about who is the better player, DeJuan Harris or Arthur Kaluma. I would argue DeJuan Harris, but if you want to say based on these stats and this and that, but whatever, it doesn't matter because that they're not in competition with each other. DeJuan's playing the point guard. So anyway, I don't even know why I brought that up. But point being, if you have DeJuan Harris and Hunter Dickinson, who aren't even in competition with Arthur Kaluma, let's just talk about the wings. So you have Rylan Griffen and AJ Storr. Like, I'm not sure those two aren't better players than Arthur Kaluma. Like I kind of lean toward them being, like, again, maybe in a vacuum, you can say, well, Kaluma brings more defense and rebounding than a guy like Rylan Griffen. But because the 3-point shooting is so important and so important for this roster, like Griffen, I just have that higher. You know what I mean? And then it becomes a conversation of KJ Adams versus Arthur Kaluma. And again, you can have those conversations about what's the better fit for the roster. What is Bill Self going to do? All those sorts of things. I don't know. But if you end up with a discussion of saying, well, if Arthur Kaluma wants to come to Kansas, he's going to have to come off the bench. Is he okay accepting that role? Now, maybe it's not that blunt. If you're Bill Self, it's a conversation of, hey, listen, we can't guarantee you a starting spot. We have a lot of good players that you're going to be in competition with. And if you don't win out on that competition, but we're going to give you the opportunity for the competition, we will give the avenue there. But if you don't win out on it, you're going to be coming off the bench. Now, you're still going to play a role. If you're 6th or 7th man, you're still going to get 20, 22, 24 minutes per game coming off the bench. You're still going to play a role on this team, but you're not going to be starting. Now, maybe you start. Maybe I do decide at the end of the day that it's better for us midway through the season or before the season starts that we want to play you at the 4 and Storr at the 3 and Griffen at the 2, and we'll have KJ come off the bench. But again, we don't actually know if that's going to happen or not. And it's been a struggle for me. And obviously it's been very polarizing for KU fans about the idea of would they actually have KJ come off the bench versus the crowd of Bill Self never does that sort of stuff. And you can understand, I guess from my standpoint, both kind of sides of the coin, so to speak. So, but would he make KU better is the other side of this? Yes, he would. And so from that standpoint, it is a take. I know it's really weird to take somebody else from the school that was, at your rival school and stuff, but KU brought on Parker Brown, who was at Missouri. And this just happens now. Like you saw it with, was it Aiden Holloway, who went from Auburn to Alabama earlier this offseason. Like, I don't know. I don't love it, but because that's part of college sports is the rivalries and the ingrained dislike of the other university and rooting for your players and against the other players and all that sort of stuff. But as much as I don't like it, it's kind of a thing of the past. And so if he makes your team better and he's willing to accept that role, because that's part of this too, whenever we're saying, is it a take? It's under the guise that the player is willing to come in and understand that, yeah, I might be in a smaller role than, I might be if I transfer to, I don't know, some lower level Power 5 or something like that. But yeah, if you accept that, then yeah. So I still remain steadfast that I'm a Wooga Poplar guy kind of through and through at this point. And there probably is a good argument to be had about, why mess with the ecosystem, just bring on a developmental player. And I can be open to that argument at this point if it's not a perfect 100% fit. But I think there is enough here as being a really good defender, being a good rebounder, can play the 3 or the 4 that you could say, yeah, it would make sense if they did end up kicking the tires here on Arthur Kaluma. All right, let's talk the latest news with KU because Bill Self had some interesting comments earlier this week. Welcome back into Locked on Jayhawks. Thanks for making this your first listen every day. And thank you to the everydayers who are tuning into each and every episode of the show. We'll have another Football Friday. At this point, we are down to 3 episodes a week. Obviously, if there's any big stuff or breaking news, we'll try to get you more episodes during that week. But we're going to be 3 episodes a week for the remainder of this month in kind of our off-season mode. So Bill Self spoke with the media, and he said he would like to add one more. Here's the full quote because I think you can take this in a couple, like if you just see the quote of I'd like one more, like that could be anything. And that is what he said. But he said, I'd like one more. I think that with Zach and Elmarko, they're good enough to play a lot of minutes, but I'd like to have a little bit more depth, to be honest with you. So we're still looking. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But I like where we're at. So there's a couple different things that you can look into. And I should probably mention this too. The question that was asked about, you mentioned wanting 8 starters, which is a comment he had earlier in the offseason. Do you feel like you have that? And his answer was, I'd like one more. So there's a couple ways you can take this, because if you take this as a direct reaction to, do you have your 8 starters? I'd like one more. Does that imply that the other player he wants to add is good enough to be one of those 8 starters? Because if then that is the case, then you are talking about more of a, I guess, big splash player like an Arthur Kaluma, like a Wooga Poplar, right? But if him saying, I'd like one more, and then he circles around and says, I'd like to have a little bit more depth, to be honest with you, and he was more so talking about, I'd like to have one more that can just be kind of, 8th, 9th man, just give us more depth just in case, then that is, again, a different conversation. That's more of the Jalen Coleman-Lands role. So I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that. Also interesting as part of this quote, though, that I think that with Zach and Elmarko, they're good enough to play a lot of minutes. Now, what does a lot of minutes mean for Bill Self at Kansas? That could mean 20 minutes a game. I don't know, 15 minutes a game, but like, that I think is I think that's more interesting with Zach Clemence, honestly, than Elmarko Jackson. Like Elmarko would not shock me if he's playing 15, 20 minutes a game. With Clemence, it becomes interesting just because for Zach Clemence to get 15 to 20 minutes a game, that means he is playing the 4. So I think just very interesting quotes that we'll have to take into mind for the rest of the offseason here from Bill Self. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page, where you can like and subscribe. We'll see you next time with LOJ.